Toni, please join me on stage. A round of applause for Toni, please. It's going to take me a minute to introduce her because I love this woman. So just give me a minute. Toni is an award-winning journalist who currently serves as the editor-in-chief for Cook's Country magazine and its television show. She is the author of Jubilee, Recipes from 2 Centuries of African American Cooking, and the Jemima Code, 2 Centuries of African American Cookbooks. And her forthcoming book, it's out almost,
Not
right?
yet.
All right.
November.
It's coming. Is called Juke Joints, Jazz Clubs, and Juice. Cocktails from 2 Centuries of African American Cookbooks, and it's coming out this fall, so it's almost fall. Toni is also the 2021 recipient of the Julia Child Award. She's an incredible culinary detective, which is a term that I think is so fitting for her, and she uses it a lot. And I'm excited to sit down with her and continue learning from you, which I've done over the last several years.
It is a joy to be here with you. Thank you. And to be able to meet Ed in person, because I'm also a recipient of Ed's Art of Eating Prize, which was quite a gift and
That's
an
amazing.
honor. Yeah.
Round of applause for
Thanks
that,
for
everyone.
having me.
Toni and I have sat down many times before, and so I have a sense of how you're going to answer this, but it's more of a comment than a question, and I hope that's okay with you. But so much of your work is focused on dispelling misconceptions and breaking the myths of how we think about what American food looks like. And I think we need more ground truthing from people like you that gives us an opportunity to celebrate the voices who have not been heard, African American chefs and cooks and others in the United States. I feel like this is really essential work, and I know you do too, and it's very gratifying, I know to you personally, but it's very difficult to find the truth. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
That's a great question. It was incredibly difficult to find the truth. And as a journalist, you guys were talking earlier about the need for more journalists. Journalism is a skill,
Right.
And a talent that is taught. We are taught to pursue truth in ethical ways. So we're not, with no disparagement, we aren't bloggers, we're not essayists,
Right.
we're not trying to insert ourselves into the story. The story that we're trying to tell is rooted in facts that we discover. Well, if you're trying to tell the story of African American people existing in the food world, those stories are embedded in the stories of others. There's not been a singular space until recent years where food studies focused on African American experiences. So in my desire to find representation for people in my community, I tried initially looking in all kinds of historical sources. I looked in literature, I looked in women's and African American studies, I looked in Southern studies.
Right.
I became a scholar, an independent scholar essentially. I just turned over every rock that I could find. And I could find individual stories about farmers, I could find stories about cooks, I could find stories about restaurateurs, but I never could find a total story.
Right.
And I wondered if cookbooks might be the way for me to hear the voice of the people themselves. There were really only 2 sources that I could think of that were not words translated by someone else, right? So everything I was reading was told through somebody else's perspective. Even if I was talking about reading plantation journals and ag reports and ship logs, diaries, all of those are still written in the first person, the view of the person writing. So I wanted to hear from the people themselves. Yeah. And cookbooks were one way. The second way was to read the slave narratives that were taken by the federal government in the 1930s in order to put writers to work. The government hired independent writers to travel the country, interviewing people who had been slaves as children, formerly enslaved people.
Sure.
And so embedded in a lot of their stories about their experiences, you might find 1 or 2 sentences about food. But you also found some incredible stories of resilience and perseverance and creativity and the ways that they thrived in almost barbaric circumstances. Sure. So I was able to put those 2 things together. and still remain neutral by just looking purely at what the people said as it related to what I had been reading that their observers had said about them.
It's so interesting, and it was so needed. It's still needed. You continue to do it. You mentioned how creative formerly enslaved folks were in terms of what they had to work with, and the conditions. You said they were barbaric. They were barbaric. How can you give us an example of that kind of creativity that folks were able to come up with to feed themselves, to nourish themselves, to preserve their own cultural traditions?
Sure. So I'm often quoted as saying that we're the only community did not arrive here as immigrants. And so we were not allowed to outwardly retain our food traditions.
Right.
So if you think about what it means to be a hyphenated American, whether you're a Greek American or an Italian American or a German American, traditionally those are families that brought their traditional ways with them, and then they embedded them within the native foods and cultures that they found here in the U.S. Africans were not allowed to do that. We had to become invisible in the community, and the perception was that we were only laborers. But that doesn't mean that we didn't have those thoughts and practices and methodologies in our heads, whether we demonstrated them outwardly or not. So there's a lot of argument right now about whether this is all new mythology being created by those of us that are studying these people. But it only makes sense that if you apply the same truths to African Americans that you would apply to other cultures, you can see that there has got to be creative and cultural elements that would have existed within our people. So several of those things are just habits in the ways that people cook, farming practices. We have not for years given credit to the enslaved people that were brought over here to ensure that the rice crop was successful in the Carolinas, right? The rice was apparently, they didn't know what to do with it. It was a gift to the Carolinas. They weren't sure what to do with this Carolina gold rice, but the Africans who had been growing millet and other grains in the west coast of Africa did know what to do with it. And so that's an entire discussion that's being had now about the contributions of African enslaved people to rice growing. In California, in Freedom, we were known for having a citrus community that's never talked about. We had freedmen's communities that were totally agricultural. So in Kansas, for example, there was a full wheat growing community and people that were bakers. Enslaved people often had to hide these practices. There's stories in Texas of people who hid the vegetables in the planter's in his flower garden in order to ensure that they could have them, because they knew that the planters were not going to go into those parts of the grounds, but they could have fresh vegetables there.
It's incredible. It's incredible that sort of resilience that people had to survive and preserve what was so special to them from their own countries.
Exactly. And now more and more people are starting to retrieve that information. So as I said, because we don't have that deeply rooted African-American connection, everything that's been described for us has been in terms of those survival foods. And those survival practices, which tend to lead us to think in terms of what's been called soul food and those survival foods. And also the idea that primarily the work that we've done has been hard labor. We have done lots and lots of hard labor, there is no doubt about that. But within that, and some of this is being misrepresented, so I want to be really careful here because it's my own words that are getting twisted against me. But the idea that people survive and create a life for themselves out of hardship does not mean that that hardship was good for them. So we have to be really careful when we are defending the fact that people made a way out of no way, and don't misrepresent that as that time period being a good thing for those people. But that's what we're starting to hear that a little bit. And so I heard my own work being flaunted there. But there is no disparagement against soul food and the practices of creating food from hog leftovers, right? I mean, we're here with hog farmers, and those are the foods that primarily sustained the enslaved, were the leavings, the carcasses, the bony parts, the innards. Like, that's the offal is primarily what has been associated with African American
There was
cooking.
no food waste.
There was no waste. They received all of that. And they were able to make do with it, with some practices that they recalled from Africa. One of the interesting things that I've just been talking about with more African chefs of African descent, who are talking about the use of palm oil. Palm oil is extracted from palm trees, and it's a bright, vivid, red, beautiful, flavorful, potent oil. But in America, we highly process it and hydrogenate it, and then it becomes terrible for you.
Right.
And it's part of most packaged foods. It's the first item that's on the label. But these folks accented the dish at the end, the stew or the pot of vegetables, whatever they were cooking, with that. And when they come here to America, one of the beautiful things about the hog leavings is that it creates that same silky texture on the vegetables. And so this idea that, collard greens and green beans and some of those southern favorites are perceived to be fatty, there is actually an African rationale for some of that.
Yeah.
So there's just, I could go for hours about all of the, between the food, between the agriculture, between the restaurant and business sense that people use to survive. It's just an incredible story.
It is an incredible story, and it needs to be heard and told much more than it has been. So thank you for being such a leader in telling those stories and dispelling what we've all been told and learned, especially as white folks. And so I think it's so important. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the value of using different kinds of media, as you do, in exploring cultural traditions around food. Why is it so valuable to have, journalism and writing, journalism and television, cookbooks that tell these different kinds of stories?
Well, we all come at this content in our own ways, food is very personal. Everyone thinks because they cook, they have a natural expertise, and we all do.
Sure.
But we can approach food in various ways, and my magazine starts with a recipe that has very minimal. It used to have very minimal storytelling before I was hired 3 years ago. It was primarily the recipes in the magazine were primarily functional,
right?
Very instructional, very much focused on the recipe development and the methodologies. And I've carried this same practice of storytelling now into the pages of Cook's Country and thus onto the television show. And that way, wherever point you enter, you can hear it. So there are now stories with background. There's always a source that's attributed to a recipe.
Right.
We're no longer just obfuscating and assuming that recipes just make themselves. They don't. A cook made those recipes.
Right.
And we don't often talk about recipe copyright and ownership. That if you have a recipe that I really love and you share it with me and you used pork and I want to use beef, then it becomes my recipe when I change it.
Interesting.
And we don't often talk about that, that the mistress of the house would have been giving those recipes, of course, to those cooks initially.
Right.
But once that cook went back into that dusty hearth space where she cooked, those recipes became the cook's recipes until they transferred again.
Right. And again.
And again and again and again. And so we're using multiple media to appeal to people. You get some technique on the TV show quite a bit at Cook's Country. But one of the first things that I did for Cook's Country, and we brought some samples, so I hope they're here somewhere.
Yeah. We'll look for those.
We'll look for them. I don't know where they are. But Matthew Rayford of Gaillard Farms is our first farmer on the back page of our magazine. And so there's no story. for him. There's no link. It doesn't drift to any other place. It's just to turn a spotlight on to him as a generational farmer in Brunswick, Georgia. And the struggle, the ultimate story we will tell on television is the struggle he's having to maintain his land.
Yeah.
But for now, the photos that we took there in the harvesting of that story are just so compelling and beautiful that we just wanted to share them. And so this page has been created. Really, it was startling to the people at America's Test Kitchen when I suggested that we were going to have a page that was devoted only to the face of a person and not to a recipe.
It's such a creative and different way of talking about food that's not just focused on the technique. I think so much of what we see on television is technique and not the story behind the people or the ingredients.
And we are seeing a lot more people doing these interview stories, going into people's communities and homes and telling stories. Padma has left Top Chef in order to do that with Taste the Nation. But something that's really interesting that's happening now is that the internet has made it possible for people to tell their own stories.
Right.
And so we're in this particularly interesting space now where we do need more journalists and we do need people with an expertise and understanding of how to tell an accurate, neutral story for those that are too busy or unable to tell their own story. But lots of people are now carrying around their phones and telling their own story. And
we saw a lot of that during COVID, where people were talking about their recipes from their own kitchens and talking about things that were important to them.
Exactly. And at that point, they can also talk about, like, lots of things, their ethics, the food choices that they make, the ingredients that they use, and the importance of high-quality ingredients, which is one of the things that we focus on so much at America's Test Kitchen.
Well, you mentioned, the labor that goes into food, and working for a publication and a TV show like Cook's Country, how do you bring in the social components of these things that you want to talk about when you might have resistance?
Very carefully. I've been making these changes incrementally. So, as I said, the first thing was to just put this person's face on the back of the page. But there's also some intentionality that has to be included here. And it's been a welcome adjustment, I think, for my staff. They were entrenched in this idea that they changed recipes and nobody else had been involved in it.
Sure.
And now they're learning a whole new skill. And so journalism can be delivered by non-journalists. It's just that you do need some bumper guards, for the ways to do it. And to do it so that it's fun, so that it's entertaining and exciting and inspirational. I mean, the most important thing to me is not to sell magazines, right, or get people. I guess I do want to sell magazines and get people turning on the show.
Magazine.
But I really want people to enjoy what they're ingesting, right? And so for this show, the first season during COVID, when everyone left the building, and they were shooting cooking segments straight to camera, meaning there weren't two of them in conversation. So the America's Test Kitchen style is there's always two people on set.
Right.
And then they had to try this one person at a time situation. And that made it easy for me to insert onto the show with a historical segment.
Right.
And it didn't feel as awkward that I was alone in a library setting.
Right.
But we eased this idea of telling truth and additional information about a recipe through the lens of the library. And this idea that I was telling the story factually. So even if we're talking about something as fun as popcorn chicken, we're going to tell you that Eugene Gagliardi Jr. created it in Philadelphia in this time of year because he was considered the junk food king of the region. And so I've just got all of this nonsensical trivia, right, in my head, in addition to the really hard truths about African American communities, and the toggle between the two helps keep both settings light for me to make sure that people hear you and can take away from it some kernel of truth of their own. They don't have to buy all the way in, but my hope is that people will at least become curious.
Right.
Become curious, which is why we called the first book The Jemima Code. Right. I wanted to just get the information out that these people existed and not go all the way in with recipes yet. Not a lot of photos,
Sure.
right? These were just about the books as points of evidence and documentary primary sourcing.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible work. I recommend that you read all of Toni's books. They're very interesting. They're books that you can go back to and read over or go back to certain parts of it. So, Toni, I think what you've been describing is this culinary detectivism that we started the conversation off with, but you really view it as a form of activism, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
I do. Several of us that are here this weekend are fresh off of an event called the Family Reunion, and it was sponsored by a very high-profile chef, Kwame Onuachi, and Food and Wine, and held in rural Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
It's an adaptation of an event that I conceived of 10 years ago called Soul Summit in Austin, Texas. And what's exciting to me is not that connection between Soul Summit and the Family Reunion, but the fact that the next generation picked up the mantle
Right.
and found their own way to do what their ancestors had done, which is to work around the system that has not been as receptive to us. And so there were educational sessions, and there are several of us, as I said, that are here that were even at Soul Summit.
Uh-huh.
Adrienne Lipscomb was, at Soul Summit all those years ago.
That's great.
And to see her here now on panel is really exhilarating for me. So it says that with some sharing of the truth, with people being able to see real role models, which was my
Right.
whole goal,
Right.
was finding true role models from whom we could all learn. So
Yeah.
not just young African Americans who might be inspired into these industry spaces, but also for the rest of society to perhaps open opportunities to them
Right.
by realizing that African Americans have had a rich and long history of various career paths within the food system,
Right.
including farming, including creating full towns, as I said earlier. There was a woman outside of Washington, D.C. who produced grapes for wines. We have had brewers. We've had tavern owners. And so for organizations to start to embrace those young people
Mm-hmm.
and encourage them to take the next steps and remake the industry in their own image is really important. And that's what I saw this weekend that made me so happy. And there are photos of me even dancing. Like
I love it.
I lost control after all of these years of being so buttoned up because I was so happy about it.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
and I think it's a really inspirational moment for institutions to make a decision, right? That we've started on a new direction just in the way that the farmers have been talking about,
Right.
And that they're leaving behind some of those old ways.
Sure.
And it can seem heretical at the beginning, as Paul said,
Sure,
right? What he
sure.
was trying to do seemed like it was not sustainable.
First, they think you're crazy.
They think you're crazy, right? And when I hosted Soul Summit, there were 10 Black experts in the room to be part of this networking environment. This weekend, there were at least 50 of us that were just on the program, and that does not include all the others that are out in the world
Right.
that are finding new ways to create restaurants and really achieving at a higher level. So we are no longer thinking that we just want to have commodity soul food as what our product.
Right. You want different things.
They want higher quality we're high on the hog.
I love it.
They want to return, and that was the other important variable to me. What I was also in pursuit of wasn't just finding these experts and finding identity for them, but I never fit in the food world.
Right.
I did not fit. I grew up in Southern California at the beach, so I was not a Southern girl. I did not understand. The way everyone knows that is because I've openly admitted that I put sugar in my cornbread and in my grits. So those are apparently
No-nos.
Absolute no-nos, taboo. But I was looking for a space because I knew that I was surrounded by important women that mattered and who had achieved. And that's the other thing that this work does, is it helps us identify that there's more than one way, and that there were people who made their way into the middle class, put their children through college, and who did choose foods that were at a higher, more healthy level. You know, the idea of eating garden to table means African Americans only ate small amounts of meat, not only in West Africa, but also during enslavement. It was more of a garnish and a seasoning.
Right, like a condiment.
So there's a lot of variables and stories that we can tell, of course, but we can also use those real people to inspire the next generation into this work.
Right.
And not have them believe that it's I want to be careful. Of course, we all know that farm work is hard work, as we just heard, sun up to sundown. But when you love that work, when it's rewarding to you, it's different than running a commodity, farm. But what messages are we sending to the young people about what it takes to be a farmer when there's black land loss? This point for including Matthew Rayford in the back of our brand is that the developers are trying to get his land. There's one piece of property, part of the property, that he's not sure he's going to be able to hold on to it. But the front part of the land is where there's this incredible story of foraging and eating off the land, and there's a school where the enslaved children when they were freed, were educated.
Wow.
And they still have that building. His mother lives in it. And it's just incredible stories like that, the resilience of returning to the land and helping young people find creative ways to retain the few family farms that we have left, and there are only a few.
Right.
There's there's a group called Delta Dirt Vodka, and this is a young family that has gone back to their family's land, and they are making vodka out of their sweet potatoes.
Oh, I love it.
But their original thought was, what are we going to do with sweet potatoes? We're not that interested, right?
Sure.
Like, you have all that historical negative experience that makes you think you don't want to retain that land, but they have been inspired and are now making this incredible vodka with it.
So cool. I love it so
I
much.
do too.
That's great. I want to touch on one point that you mentioned. You know, so much of your work is giving folks the truth. And you mentioned women are such an important part of the work that you do in making sure that their stories are told. We have a long way to go, but we are getting there. And I'm wondering if you can sort of describe, you know, where we've come from and where we need to go now in terms of making sure that women's role in all of this is not just, you know, hey, they were cooks and now they're chefs. It's bigger and greater than that.
It is bigger than that, and I try in my work to just, as John Edgerton taught me many years ago, the Southern sage, if I can just drop one or two kernels of truth in my books, so they're heavy loaded with lots of kernels, then the next generation will pick one of those kernels up, and then they will go on to expand upon that. And so I drop a lot of names in my work just to make sure people understand that there was a woman named Bertie Brown in Montana who was known as the most hospitable moonshiner. I make sure that people understand that when we are talking about making beer, which we think of as a guy thing, that it begins with cooking a mash. Make sure I say that again. You have to cook the mash. So women were the ones cooking. The men couldn't the women were not allowed, women and people of color were not allowed to have liquor licenses, but the men could have them. So there are stories about women behind the scenes who were really the brewers or the distillers, because again, this practice involved heating something. If we don't call it cooking. And those licenses just disappear because they went into the men's names. So that's my job, is to just make sure that wherever I can, the men get plenty of credit. So I always mention the men, but at the beginning of the Jemima Code, I say that this is really a work to promote and celebrate and advocate for women who have also been invisible. So not just African Americans, but also women. And that's becoming evident also at Cook's Country. As we wrap, I can just say
No,
that
please.
we are working on a similarly minded project about Southern women.
Nice.
And so the working title for the book is called When Southern Women Cook. And what we are doing is telling you the stories that involve women behind our favorite iconic Southern dishes. So stay tuned for that. It'll be out next fall, and America's Test Kitchen is publishing that. And we have asked lots and lots of Southern women to tell their stories, whether it be what it was like to cook in a male's kitchen, what it has meant to be the one who created the hot brown, like whatever the stories are, they're out there.
It's fantastic. I can't wait. Look for the magazine later today. We will have it out, Cook's Country. Toni Tipton Martin, the greatest culinary detective of all time. Please give her a round of applause.
Thank you.